I'm opening the room now. Hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. If everyone could mute themselves when you enter, and we'll get started here in just about a minute.
Of them.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. And if everyone could just mute your mic when you join us today, and it's up to you if you want to leave your camera on or not right now. We will have opportunities to interact later, and we encourage everyone to think of some questions to ask our guests, and we will call on you here in a bit to raise those questions. So my name is Kyle Carlson. I'm representing Environment for the Americas, and we thank you for joining our book club today. We do this each month featuring different authors of amazing bird books. And Environment for the Americas, for those who are not familiar, we are a nonprofit based in Boulder, Colorado, and our mission is to connect people, connect cultures to conservation, specifically in most cases with bird conservation. Our primary program is World Migratory Bird Day, which is a global annual campaign that celebrates the migration of birds across countries and continents. It is officially celebrated on the second Saturdays of May and October, but it is really a year-long campaign. You can learn more about this at migratorybirdday.org. Each year, we focus on a different conservation theme, which in 2023 is going to be water, focusing on water conservation and the importance of water to migratory birds. The importance of water in all its forms, from lakes and ponds and rivers to coastal areas. We will be featuring many messages related to this and focusing on 10 species of birds here in the Americas, each that represents a different aspect of the importance of water to birds. Another big part of Environment for the Americas is that we administer diversity internship programs with many partners around the country. These programs include Mosaics in Science, Latino Heritage Internship Program, Resource Assistance, Fish and Feathers, and many other programs. And you can learn more about these at environmentamericas.org/diversity internships. We are currently hiring for some of these programs for the upcoming spring and summer. So if you know any students or early career professionals that may be interested in these programs, they all are offering on-the-ground experience in conservation and environmental science. Many of these positions are open at sites across the country, available at that website. I encourage you to check that out. There are many ways you can support Environment for the Americas. One is to shop at the EFTA store, which you can find on our website, environmentamericas.org. You can become a member, you can donate. And we appreciate all of the support to allow us to continue to do these things, to distribute World Migratory Bird Day materials, to administer these internship programs, and to put on programs such as this program you're joining today, to many of our friends and supporters. You can stay in touch with us through our website. You can go on there and get on our email list. We send out weekly email newsletters with updates about all of these programs. You can contact us directly at info@environmentamericas.org or follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and more. Before we pass the program over to our guest today, invite you to check out next month's Bird Book Club, which is going to be the book Slow Birding. That will be Thursday, February 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register at migratorybirdday.org/Bird Book Club. So joining us today is Dr. Tim Birkhead, who will be talking to us about his recent book, Birds and Us, a 12,000-year history from cave art to conservation. It is a sweeping history of the long and close relationship between birds and people. Dr. Birkhead is an award-winning author and one of the world's leading bird biologists. He is the co-author of 10,000 Birds, Ornithology Since Darwin, and the author of The Wonderful Mr. Willoughby, the First True Ornithologist, The Most Perfect Thing, the Inside and Outside of a Bird's Egg, and Bird Sense, What It's Like to Be a Bird, among many other books. He's a fellow of the Royal Society and professor emeritus of zoology at the University of Sheffield. He is joining us from the other side of the Atlantic today, which is why we are hosting this at a slightly different time than we normally do. But we're thankful that Dr. Birkhead was able to join us today and that all of you are with us today as well. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Tim and he will share a short presentation. And after that, we will come back together to engage in some question and answer time about this book and about ornithology in general. So Dr. Birkhead.
Thank you, Kyle. Hello to everybody. We've had a slight technical problem in terms of me sharing my screen. So we've kind of had to improvise a little bit. So I'll ask for the first slide, which is the slide of, this is the only way you can do this, is the slide with pink flowers, please.
Yes.
So this is a sedge warbler on the island of Skoma, where I've been working for the last 50 years, not on sedge warblers, but on common murres. In England, we call those common guillemots. The book that I'm going to talk about a little bit about today is Birds and Us. And in a way, this is a kind of culmination of my long career studying birds, but bird watching as well, and enjoying different aspects of birds. And I got the idea for the book because not far from where I live here in northern England, during the winter, there's a large starling roost. And everybody really enjoys those huge murmurations of starlings before they go into their roost. And one winter when there were probably around 1 million birds in this roost, I went up pretty well every evening. And sometimes there were as many as 300 people watching the birds. And it was, you know, the most breathtaking experience to have the birds flying really low over our heads before they went into the roost. It was very exciting. But when I looked around at these 300 people, I realized that I was the only person with binoculars. Most of those people weren't what you would call birders or bird watchers. They were there just for the spectacle. And I started thinking about this, and it made me realize that we've obviously had a very, very long relationship with birds, and that relationship has changed dramatically over time. For most of that history of our relationship with birds, it's been one of exploitation, so it's not a very positive one. We've exploited birds mainly as a source of food, but also for their feathers, whether to make quilts or to stuff mattresses, but also for their feces as well. I mean, mining of guano on the South American islands to create fertilizer has been a major source of exploitation, not so much of the birds themselves, but what they've left behind. And then we kind of get to the beginning of the 20th century and things start to change. Suddenly there's a new kind of empathy for birds. And if I could have the, I can't now even see my own slides now, which is a bit frustrating. So you just pick a slide at random. Okay, that one will do. I can improvise here. So this actually shows all the bird species that I've done studies on during the course of my career. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the one at the top left is the common murre, and you'll recognize some of the other ones. The North American yellow-billed magpie, which I studied in California. Next to that, to the right, is the aquatic warbler. There it's in mating posture. This is the most promiscuous bird ever, and has the most bizarre mating patterns. Male and female mate for about 12 hours at a time, the male clinging onto the female's back, and this all happens deep in a reed bed. And then, of course, there's common sparrow. I've also worked on chickens, and then black-billed magpies as well. Okay, next one. Just find another slide. So during the course of our relationship with birds, people have engaged in birds in all sorts of different ways, and we tend to think that there's only one way to engage with birds. And in Britain, that involves, and probably in North America as well, that involves going to a bird reserve, going to a hide or blind to watch birds, and sitting there with your binoculars and cameras. But in fact, people have engaged in birds in all sorts of different ways. Some people keep caged birds like canaries. The people in the middle, people in parks and so on often feed pigeons. And then on the right on that image, in Britain at least, people breed racing pigeons that they train up as though they're kind of top athletes, feeding them on special diets and so on to undertake either very short races or great long endurance races. As I was saying, at the beginning of the 20th century, our attitude to birds started to change. We became much more empathetic towards birds. And in a way, that was the beginning of the conservation of birds. And of course, that now is something that concerns all of us. And the world is full of numerous diverse threats to birds. Now, if you could make the next slide, the one that's got an island, it's a no, not that one. Next one, that's the final one. Okay, this one. So I've also been, my 50-year study of common murres has been taking place on this island on the top right. This is Skomer Island off the west coast of Wales in Britain. And I started my PhD there in 1972 and have been going back every year since. We have some photographs of that island taken in the 1930s when the population of common murres was around 100,000 pairs. But by 1972, which is when I started my PhD, the population had crashed to 2,000 pairs. So the aim of my study was to try to find out what had caused the crash and basically how bird populations like a murre, how their populations work. Luckily for me, or luckily for the murres as well, from about 1980, numbers have been increasing, and they've been increasing ever since. And this is actually quite anomalous because pretty well everywhere else in the world and in Britain, seabird populations are in steep decline. And so I've been trying to understand why birds are doing so well there. On the far right is a murre's egg. They lay these beautifully brightly colored, highly pointed eggs. And just to the right of that is a common murre chick just before it leaves the colony. And so this has been a major part of my life, but I've also studied lots of aspects of bird biology, including promiscuity in birds. That's been a major theme because for many years, starting with Darwin, people assumed that birds were monogamous, but it turns out that they're actually not monogamous. Often a lot of birds that have long-term pair bonds are also promiscuous as well. So that's kind of an introduction. The key message, I suppose, I want to make in the book is that after centuries of exploitation of birds, starting in the 20th century, we started to become concerned about bird populations, concerned about conservation. And that's such a recent thing. It's also a rather fragile thing. And so I'm really just hoping that that is going to continue as the threats to birds become greater and greater. So I'll stop there and ask if anybody has any questions.
Yes, thank you, Tim. If anyone has any questions or comments, you can do one of two things. You can go to the bottom of your screen and click on reactions and then click on raise hand. And then we will call on you and you can turn on your camera and mic and present your question. Or if you'd rather not be on camera, you can drop your question in the chat, and Daisy and I will be monitoring that to read those aloud and address your questions. So while folks are thinking about that, I have a few questions I'll ask to kind of kick things off. And one is, here in the US, we have certainly seen a surge of interest in birds and birding sparked by the pandemic. And you actually mentioned this in the book. So I take it that you have seen this sort of renewed interest in birds in Europe as well. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that and what you think that says about the appeal of birds, that so many people looked that direction during a difficult time.
That's a very good question. I think at a time when people were feeling rather desperate about the world during the COVID pandemic, the consolation of nature, whether it be birds or other aspects of the natural world, were incredibly important to people. And it would be slightly ironic, but rather wonderful, if the COVID pandemic had a longer term effect in terms of making people appreciate natural history, appreciate birds. And of course, the great thing about birds is that almost wherever you live, you can see birds, you can enjoy birds. So lots of people have feeders, for example, and that's a great way of bringing birds close to us. And one thing I think that would be very interesting, resulting from the comment that you've just made, would be whether any of the ornithological organizations have undertaken any surveys to quantify the extent that the pandemic caused in terms of the increase in interest in birds. Have more people joined societies? Have more people signed up for ornithological events? I mean, obviously, some of that was kind of finding things to do during the pandemic, but it would be great if the result of the pandemic was a much greater and wider interest in birds.
Absolutely, and it would be good to kind of have some real data on that. I know anecdotally, just as things were starting to open up again, and I would lead a bird walk or a program of some kind, and I had been reading articles suggesting that there was this renewed interest, but then seeing it firsthand, where quite a number of people would say, this is my first bird walk. They took up bird feeding or something like that during the pandemic, and the first opportunity they had to go out, they were engaging in it. And from the looks of it, again, anecdotal from my own experiences, it seems like it's sticking. Maybe it started as something to do when there wasn't much else to do, but it sparked a real interest, and it would be wonderful if that resulted in more people joining, more people making this a lifelong thing, and of course, in turn, supporting conservation causes. Absolutely.
I think that one of the really interesting things, and I've done lots of bird walks, is that if you're reasonably knowledgeable about birds as a leader, it's not that difficult to enthuse people about the complexities and subtleties of bird life, and people become absolutely fascinated. So in Britain, for example, one of the common birds, relatively common birds, that turns up on feeders is something called the bullfinch. You don't have that in North America. But this is an absolutely remarkable bird. It's highly monogamous. It's one of those birds that I think doesn't have much promiscuity. And the male and female are very tightly bonded, probably for successive breeding seasons. And in the past, when people kept bullfinches as pets, the birds had this incredible ability to mimic any tune that was whistled to them. And some bullfinches could whistle 3 or 4 long tunes, and they did it perfectly. They did it better than the person that trained them, because somehow they have something in their brain that says, actually, this tune should go like this, or it would go better like this. So in the past, when people trained bullfinches, there would be pauses in the song as the person breathed in or out. The bullfinches edit all that out. And so there's something absolutely remarkable about the bullfinch's brain. And what we think is happening is that it takes more brain power to be monogamous than it does to be polygamous. And probably people know that already. But what I think is happening is that when people are training bullfinches, the birds are co-opting those bits of their brain, all that cognitive ability that they would use in terms of maintaining their pair bond, trying to anticipate what their partner's going to do next, in terms of learning and being able to replicate a song. So they are absolutely amazing birds. And telling people about this who see a bullfinch, know nothing about that before, that kind of thing can transform their appreciation.
Absolutely, that's fascinating, and birds in general are certainly completely fascinating.
I think we have a couple of questions, Kyle, in the chat box. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, we have a few questions here. So first one is from Gwen. Asks, why so brightly colored the eggs? Maybe you could speak to why eggs are brightly colored in general.
Okay, well, why they're brightly coloured in general is a big question, and you need some time. But I'm going to talk briefly about murre eggs. So the interesting thing about murre eggs is that every individual female lays an egg of a different colour and pattern. Because these are very beautiful eggs, both in terms of their size, they just fit nicely in your hand, the patterning and colour, these were widely collected when egg collecting was legitimate in the past. And the guillemot's egg was the favourite amongst collectors. They liked the fact that because of that variation, it gave them an excuse to collect lots of them, and people did collect lots of them. And then in the 1950s, a Swiss biologist started to think about why they were all these different colors. And it turns out that they are these different colors because, as you can see in the picture above the egg, guillemots, or murres, sorry, as you call them, breed in very close proximity to each other. And having an individually recognizable egg allows them to recognize and retrieve their own egg if it happens to roll away in those dense breeding groups. So in this case, the variation and bright colors has evolved for individual recognition. In other cases, in other bird species, egg color has evolved as camouflage for those birds that breed on the ground. That's when birds produce khaki colored eggs that are mottled and match the background. A few birds produce brightly colored eggs as a strategy to avoid brood parasites like cowbirds. So there's a kind of arms race going on between the host species, which might be a warbler in North America, and the cowbird. Birds that breed in cavities or burrows typically produce white eggs. And that's because with the little amount of light that gets into those cavities, the egg is still visible, and it prevents the incubating bird from stepping on its egg accidentally. So those are the kind of main reasons why eggs vary in color and why many of them are so brightly colored.
Thank you for that. Next question is from Ken. Asks, what accounted for the change in attitudes about birds in the early 20th century?
Okay, that's a great question. So the beginning of the conservation movement happened in about 1860. And at another seabird colony that I've worked at on the east coast of Britain, it's an area called Flamborough Head, there was a huge seabird colony, and people used to go there simply for the pleasure of shooting birds for no other purpose. They didn't collect the bodies, they didn't do anything with them, they just shot them off the cliffs. And a few local people were absolutely appalled by this. One of the people that got to hear of this was the great Victorian ornithologist, Alfred Newton. And he'd recently come back from a trip to Iceland, where he'd been trying to find the extinct great auk. But what he found was that the great auk had gone extinct 10 or 20 years previously. And he was deeply shaken by the fact that humans could have caused the extinction of an entire species. And that's what happened to the great auk. People hunted it to death. He came back, heard about this shooting that was going on the east coast of Britain, and he was responsible for the first Seabird Protection Act in 1869. And that was really the beginning of the bird protection movement. Shortly after that, people started to become aware of the fact that lots of women's hats included feathers and even whole birds, and people started to campaign against the plume trade. So that was all happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then there were one or two pioneers who were coming at bird biology from a slightly different point of view. Prior to that, most bird biologists had worked in museums. And of course, museum curators often collected birds for their collections. But one or two people, Miriam Bailey, a woman in North America, and Edmund Selous in Britain, said, put down your gun, use your binoculars instead, and watch birds, and you will find that much more rewarding. And Edmund Selous in Britain was particularly influential. And he was really the beginning of bird watching, and in fact produced a book called Bird Watching. And over the next 20 or 30 years, interest in that area grew. So suddenly we'd shifted from killing birds for fun or killing birds for museums to watching birds, partly for fun, but also that was the beginning of the study of bird behavior. So Edmund Selous tested some of Darwin's ideas about why grouse and other birds displayed in groups. And he proved some of Darwin's hypotheses. And so he was really a pioneer in the study of bird behavior. And then things took off from there.
Thank you for that. Cindy asks, do you have hope for the future of birds despite climate change?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Climate change and avian flu are currently some of the major threats to bird populations. In terms of climate change, it will bring about massive changes in distribution. We're already seeing that in Europe. I don't think it's going to cause many or any extinctions, but we will see major changes in where birds occur. So in Europe, a lot of southern birds are now becoming increasingly common. But of course, for those birds that have a very northerly distribution, those that breed in the Arctic, then climate change may prove to be a very serious threat. In a slightly different way, avian flu has been much more damaging in as much that it kills birds directly. And in Britain, gannets, great skewers, and a number of other species, including murres in some colonies, have undergone or experienced huge mortality. So that's much more worrying. When I go back to my island Skoma next year, I'm hoping that the bird flu will have disappeared, but who knows, it might not have done.
Right, we're seeing some effects of avian flu here in the United States as well.
Mainly with waterfowl?
Yes, waterfowl, and then indirectly raptors that are feeding on the waterfowl.
Oh,
That's,
really?
that's what I've been hearing about. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Want to remind everyone, a few people have just joined us. If you have any questions for our guest, Tim Birkhead, to raise your hand, we'll call on you and you can ask your question directly, or you can drop it in the chat and we'll relay it for you. And Jill asks that, says, I was fascinated by your chapter about Egypt and that there were something like 4 million bird mummies, but you didn't seem to indicate that this was threatening to the populations there. Okay,
that's a good point. Well, it might well have been threatening to the populations there because sacred ibises no longer breed in Egypt. We don't know whether it was because they were captured in order to turn them into votive offerings and mummies. It could have been due to climate change or something else. But there were a lot of ibises mummified, and really nobody knows where they all came from. I mean, obviously it was happening over a long period of time, but still 4 million ibis mummies is a staggering number. And there have been various attempts to try to understand where those birds came from. Were they captured from the wild? Were their eggs taken from the wild and then reared in captivity so that they could be sacrificed? We just don't know. So it is a mystery. And you're right, I probably should have said something a little bit more about whether it was threatening the population.
Yes, thank you. Another question I have for you is, as someone who's been, studying birds for a long time and researching this particular book, what was the single most surprising thing that you learned?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'd have to think about that. When you write a book of the type that I write, it involves a lot of research and a lot of reading. And for me, that is one of the most enjoyable aspects of producing a book, is doing the work that goes before you actually start writing. I think one of the most striking things that I came across was an ornithologist called Oscar Heinroth in Germany, who was active just before the Second World War. He was curator of the Berlin Aquarium at the zoo. And luckily for him, he wasn't that interested in fish, but he was interested in birds. Luckily for him, the aquarium had a big collection of waterfowl. So he did some of the pioneering work on the behavior, the mating behavior and courtship behavior of ducks and geese. And so that was really important. Then he got married, and unfortunately his wife wasn't able to have children. She got rather bored at home. And on one occasion, he and his wife were in a market, and they saw for sale a couple of nightjars, nocturnal birds, a bit like the old nighthawks. And so they bought these birds. There were 2 juveniles. They were in terrible condition, but she reared them back to health and maturity, and they became incredibly tame, and they stayed in the 2 birds stayed in their apartment. They became so tame that when people came round to dinner, the birds would sometimes land on their head, and the 2 birds bred together, breeding on a wild boar skin rug in the front room. Oscar realized that his wife, Magdalena, had incredible ability with rearing birds. And he decided that a really interesting project would be to hand rear as many different bird species as possible, so that he could try to separate out the roles of nature and nurture in the adult bird's behavior. And this snowballed into one of the most monumental projects. Over 20-odd years, Magdalena reared over 1,000 individual birds. This is all in their apartment in the zoo, ranging from tiny little goldcrest, which is Britain's or Europe's tiniest bird, through to the bearded vulture, which is, one of the biggest birds that exists, and over 300 species. And the terrible thing was that when it came to writing all this up, he kind of lost track, really, of the original objective. And so he wrote an account. It was beautifully illustrated with his photographs. But the main message about whether behavior was driven by nurture or nature seemed to get lost. And then Second World War intervened, and his wife died before the war. He died during the latter few days of the war. And the book, which was only published in German, it was 4 huge volumes, basically disappeared from people's minds. So I worked with a German colleague, and we went through those volumes, and he discovered all the photographs that Oscar Heinroth had taken that were still stored in the basement of the Berlin Zoo that had survived the bombing by the Brits. And so that was one of the best stories. And if you think about it, also one of the closest relationships between people and birds. She hand-reared all those birds. She lived with them, sometimes for years and years. The apartment must have just been full of birds. So I think that was a fantastic story.
Well, yeah, that is a great story. Another question is, how do you think our relationships with birds have differed from our relationships with other animal groups, say mammals?
Okay, that's a great question. Birds have a particular appeal, as most people who are birders know, because they're quite like us. They rely on vision and sound like we do. Most of them, not all, but many of them, or most of them, are diurnal. In contrast, most mammals are nocturnal, so they're not that easy to see, and they rely much more on scent, and that we don't have a particularly fantastic sense of smell. And so even though they're mammals and we're mammals, they just seem a bit more alien to us. And of course, I think the most important thing of all is that the majority of birds are incredibly beautiful. They often have very bright colors and elaborate plumage with long tails and crests and so on. And I think that visual appeal is very strong, much stronger than it is for mammals or many other taxonomic groups.
Absolutely. And I think something you touched on earlier is just the accessibility. Anywhere you go, there are birds somewhere.
Yeah, that's not the case for mammals.
Right. Another question for you. You discuss in the book these Neolithic cave paintings of birds. I was wondering if you could tell us more about the discovery of those paintings and their significance, and what that experience was like for you personally as you were researching.
Okay, my wife and I have been going to Spain for the last 35 years, to Andalusia. It's one of my favorite places. It's very rich in bird life. It's relatively unspoilt environment. And a few years ago, I've always been interested in cave art. And I was looking on the internet for examples of cave art in the vicinity of where we stay. To my amazement, I came across a reference to a cave that was only about 30 kilometers away from the village in which we stay, which had a collection of bird paintings on its walls. I was absolutely stunned by this. I instantly emailed a few Spanish friends and asked about the cave and discovered where it was, and then discovered that it was private and you couldn't just walk in there and have a look. But with a good Spanish ornithologist, he contacted the local authorities, and I was eventually given permission to go and visit. And then I was incredibly lucky that they put me in touch with the archaeologist that had recently studied the cave. Before I went, I did my homework and discovered that the cave had been found. The local people had known about the cave for many, many years. They thought that the images on its walls had been created by the Moors, who had lived in Spain for several centuries, but didn't really take much notice. And then a British kind of hunter, really, who was also an ornithologist, visited that area in the early 1900s. And he was told about the cave, but he didn't really take any interest in it, because at that time, people didn't recognize that early man had got these artistic abilities or painted caves. So the first painted caves that were discovered were thought to be fakes. And then, of course, people came along and went, well, cavemen couldn't possibly create these images. If you think about the images in Lascaux and some of the other famous caves, they just seem to be too sophisticated. Eventually, this chap, Willoughby Werner, did go and have a look at the caves. And of course, he was blown away. This was in about 1910, 1911. Subsequently, a number of different archaeologists had been there. And after I'd made these discoveries and contacted the archaeologist, she agreed to meet us at the cave and very wisely brought somebody from the English department so that they could act as an interpreter. And I have to say that being in that cave, which was tiny, you could touch both sides with your arch outstretched arms. You could touch the roof with your arm above your head. It's tiny. It's a kind of scoop in the rock. That was one of the most moving experiences of my entire ornithological career, because the walls are just covered in these paintings. And there's over 200 images of birds. They're not very big, they're just a few centimeters high. And the reason that that's significant is that birds feature very rarely indeed in cave art. We're all familiar with the bison and horses and woolly rhinoceroses that occur in cave art, but birds are incredibly scarce. And in fact, there are more birds in that one tiny cave than there are in probably all other known caves in existence. They date from about 8,000 years ago. And of course, like other cave art, nobody really knows why they were done. My interpretation is that this was related to hunting, which people subsisted on, because the cave is located just north of the Straits of Gibraltar, through which millions, literally millions and millions of birds pass, going north in the spring and south in the winter. And the cave was opposite a big marsh. And so this must have been a fantastic place for hunting. Finally, I'll just say that the most remarkable thing about these paintings is they're probably done with just person's fingers in red ochre, but they're so good, you can identify nearly all the species. Herons, vultures, waders, just bustards, absolutely fantastic. And the good thing is that the female archaeologist who showed me the cave has now made the cave accessible to the public, so people can now book and go and see it for themselves. It's not very practical because the cave's only big enough to take about 2 or 3 people at a time, and you have to climb up a steep ladder to get there. But I'd say it was well worth the experience.
That's amazing, and great to hear that it's others are able to visit that and experience that now too. You mentioned that a lot of the birds you could identify them. Does it reflect what you would expect in that region from a modern perspective, or any differences?
Absolutely. The match is exactly what happens in the marsh. So in front of the cave is an area called Lahanda. It was a big marsh, and people may be familiar with another area in Spain called the Coto Doñana, which is, the main hotspot for bird watchers in southern Spain. And this area, Lahanda, was probably like that in Neolithic times. And in fact, it was probably like that up until the 1960s, when Franco decided to drain the marsh to turn it into a rice growing area, which is pretty terrible. But the good news is that the local conservation groups now are trying to revert it back to a marsh. So there's kind of hope. It's still a good bird watching spot, even though it is an absolute fraction of what it once was. But it was precisely because it was so rich for birds. And the birds that you see there today are all the ones that are reflected in the cave paintings.
Very interesting. Thank you. We just have a few minutes here. If there's anyone that would still like to drop a question or raise your hand and engage with us here.
Feel free to ask me anything about birds. Don't restrict it to kind of what I've been talking about so far. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yes, let's take advantage. Any of your ornithological questions, this is your opportunity.
Okay, so there's a question there that I can see. How can we read more about Heinroth's nightjars? Well, you can read it in my book, but the original research was done by a colleague of mine, Carl Schulze-Hagen, who I've been collaborating with. He's a medic, but he's a top ornithologist as well. I've been collaborating with him for about 35 years. And he wrote an account of Oscar Heinroth and his wife, but it's only published in German. It was incredible. His book was incredibly popular in Germany. And I kept saying, when are we going to get a translation? But no British publisher or English-speaking publisher is interested in doing it, which is a real shame. So you just have to read that bit in my book.
Very good. And Sherry asks, why did you write this book? What is the overarching message you want readers to take away from it?
Okay, the overarching message is we need to take care of birds. Our current relationship with birds, that one of protection, is one that we kind of take for granted. But what history has shown us is that the current situation is recent and tiny and fragile. And so hopefully by making people aware that the current perception of birds is a rather fragile one, I hope that will encourage people to think more about protecting birds. So that is my overarching theme in the book.
Excellent. And Jill asks, do you have another book planned?
Yeah, but writing books is compulsive. You know, one becomes obsessed. I love doing the research. And before I retired, I was a university teacher, and I did research as well, obviously. But I love giving lectures to undergraduates and trying to inspire them in both animal behavior, ecology, and evolution. So researching stuff and reading stuff and then trying to make it accessible to more people has been my entire way of life. And the next book is going to be on the great auk, which in a way is a symbol of human folly and greed. But there's also some really interesting biology to do with the great auk as well. And that's been a very enjoyable book to research.
Awesome. We'll look forward to that. Sue asks, should we seek developing relationships with the birds at our feeders or not?
That's an interesting question. In a way, simply by feeding birds and watching them, you are already forming a relationship. Depends how close a relationship you want to form. Now, there's a slide that we haven't shown yet, which is of a European robin, if we could have that on the screen. Can you see it? Not that one. That one, okay. So that one, that's a European robin. And I did form a close relationship with this bird because during lockdown, I just bought some mealworms and decided I would tame the 2 pairs of robins that breed in our garden. And they're very easy to tame. And of course, in a way, it's kind of the national bird of Britain. It appears on all our Christmas cards. But they are absolutely endearing. And even today, if I go out of the back door, a bird is fluttering in front of my face, basically asking for some mealworms. So I go and get a handful of mealworms. And there are 4 birds in total. The 2 males often chase each other off, but it's an immensely rewarding relationship. When I was writing the book, I looked at another book written by a colleague of mine called Tales of a Tribe, which is about birders. And he tries to categorize the different types of people that engage with birds. And it's basically a continuum. At one end, he had academics who he's a bit dismissive of because he's not an academic. And at the other end, he has what are called robin strokers, which he portrays as kind of basically old ladies in their front room that watch the robins and like a thrill of that. But actually, while I was writing the book, one of these 4 robins used to come into the room where I have my laptop, this room that I'm in now, and would hop around above me, again, asking for mealworms. And so I wrote about that in the book because I am a professor, but I'm also a robin stroker as well. In other words, it's very difficult to categorize all the kinds of different ways that people engage with birds. And I'm sure in North America, you could try taming birds with particular bits of food that they might like. But that is a special relationship.
Absolutely. I've had similar experiences with eastern bluebirds coming to mealworms, not quite as individually personable as what you described, but they know where the food is coming from, and they interact with you and come to the window and all that. And I agree, whatever your relationship with birds is, I think a lot of us can appreciate and enjoy bird feeding. It brings them into our space.
There's one, sorry to interrupt. There's one slide that I haven't spoken about. If we could put that up, there's something I'd quite like to say. You flick through it just before that one, not that one. This one, okay. So one of the most striking things about the history of our relationship with birds is it's mainly written by men, as you might imagine. Women have played a relatively small part in the history of ornithology, at least up until the kind of 1970s. So I tried very hard to find examples where women had made a really important contribution to ornithology. And I came across this lady, Jemima Blackburn, from the late 1800s, who turns out to have been this superb artist. She was on a par with the best male artists. You can see at the bottom of the screen on the left is her drawing, it's a painting actually, of a European cuckoo. She was also a tough, independent, scientifically minded woman. So she rates very highly for me. And the story here is that John Gould, who was the birdman, most famous ornithologist in Britain at that time, produced these massive, lavish books. And he had just started writing about the European cuckoo when he came across a note that Jemima Blackburn had sent to the journal Nature. She had seen, and it's illustrated at the top right here, a young cuckoo that had just hatched, pushing its host's young out of the nest. These were meadow pipits that it was kicking out. And John Gould thought, oh, I can use that in my illustration. And so it wasn't really plagiarism, but he kind of used his observation. He used Jemima Blackburn's observations to produce his own image, which is at the bottom. Now you can see in this bottom image, there's the young cuckoo throwing out the meadow pipit chicks. There's 3 or 4 of them lying around. And in the background is the adult meadow pipit. Now, Gould was vehemently anti-Darwinian and did not accept Darwin's explanation for the cuckoo's brood parasitism. And the only way that he could make sense of it in his own mind was if the parent pipits approved of the young cuckoo throwing out and killing their offspring. It's kind of bonkers, really. And Jemima Blackburn was incensed when she saw this picture, and she wrote back to the journal Nature to say, I did not see this. Gould has made this up. In other words, Gould was passing off some misinformation. And so I really admired her artistic ability, her scientific scrutiny, and the fact that she was prepared to take on who was considered to be the great birdman of the late 1800s, John Gould. So I've tried hard to represent women in this book.
That's great, and thank you for sharing that story. We have a question about, how did you figure out you wanted to be an ornithologist and take care of birds?
Okay, I talked a little bit about that in the book. I was lucky in that my dad was a bird watcher. Bird watcher was starting to become popular in the 1940s, so he encouraged me. I also had an uncle who was a bird watcher, and one of the things that he did was incredibly significant. For one of my birthdays, he gave me a loose leaf, quite a large format notebook that had alternating pages, lined pages so I could write notes on what I'd seen, and plain pages so that I could paint. So I've always liked painting. And most importantly of all, on the cover, it said the words bird notes, and underneath was my name. And he'd probably used that terrible stuff, Letraset, some might remember. But having a book with my name on it was an absolute inspiration. As I say in the book, I was absolutely useless at school. I used to leave school and go bird watching instead. And it wasn't until I was in my late teens that I finally pulled my act together and decided that I needed to do something. And in fact, that was the point at which I really discovered that I loved researching stuff and learning stuff. And the rest is history.
Yes, thank you. I appreciated that story in the beginning of your book about the your experience with the teacher and the great northern divers, or common loons, as we call them. Yes, we have a few kind of clarifications here as we're wrapping up. Byrne asked if you could repeat the name of the researcher when you were talking about the night jars.
Okay, his name was Oscar Heinroth, and his wife was Magdalena.
Thank you. And Lisa asked if you could repeat the name of the caves in Spain with the bird art.
Okay, its name in Spanish is Cueva de la Figuras el Tajo, which doesn't help very much, so it doesn't have an English name. But if you if you just Google rock art or cave art in Andalusia, that cave will come up.
Excellent. I think we will wrap up here in a minute. Daisy, if you have anything to add or any other questions. Fern is clarifying that she was actually looking for a different name. You mentioned a researcher, Carl.
Oh, sorry. Carl, that's his first name. And then it's a double-barreled name, Schultz-Hagen. So it's SCHULZE-HAGEN, Schultz-Hagen. I mean, if you're stuck, you can just email me and I'll send you the details of the book.
Yes, thank you.
And for those who missed some part because they couldn't connect the whole time, it will be online tomorrow. So thank you, Tim.
We're recording
My
this,
pleasure.
so it'll be available on our YouTube channel. Yes. Thank you, Tim, for joining us. This is very informative, engaging, and thank you all of you for joining in today.